All right, in this lesson, we're going to begin constructing our 3D game level. What that means is, in this video, we're going to begin constructing 3D physical objects, objects that you can see, and more importantly, objects that other objects can bump into. In this lesson, we're going to be adding a floor into our game level, which is a 3D solid object that you can see, and we're going to learn how to create reusable objects, which are going to be falling blocks that we can create as many of as we want in our game level. And the neat things about these falling blocks is that they can actually fall with gravity using Godot's built-in physics engine, and they can bump into each other and into other objects like our ground in our game level. Let's go ahead and jump in. On my desktop here, I have the Godot game engine icon, and if I go ahead and open up Godot, you can see that I have my project listed here. Just in case you're not aware, and I'll cover this right at the beginning of this course, if you open up the Godot editor and you do not see your project listed, I'm going to go ahead and select my game project and press remove. What you can do is simply take your game project folder right here and drag it into this project manager and let go, and it will add itself into the list of projects that you can go ahead and double click on to open. You can also open up that project folder and find the file that ends with .godot. That file will probably be called project.godot, and if you find that file, you can also drag it specifically into your project manager, and it'll show up in this list just like it did before for me. Okay, let's go ahead and double click on the project to open it up. As of the last lesson in this course, we made a level 1 game scene in the Godot editor. In this level 1, we have a root node as well as a camera. To add a physical object, a floor, into our game level, we have to begin by adding a type of node into our scene. Recall that from the last video, the way that we add objects into our game is by selecting the root node of our current scene. And by the way, if you don't have your scene currently open, I'll close mine. You can find it called level1.tscn down here in the file system doc on the bottom left of the Godot editor. I'll go ahead and double click on it to open it up. If I select the root node of my scene, I can then add objects into my game level. I'm going to select that root node and press plus because the type of object that we're going to add for a floor is considered a physics object in Godot. It's a physics object because it exists in a world with physics, and that means that other objects like your character, like falling blocks, can collide with it. So if I find the section, the branch of this node tree called node 3D, and I expand that out, and then I find a section here called collision object 3D, and I'll expand that branch out, and then physics body 3D and expand that section out. Don't worry if you're not following along with me here. I'll go ahead and show you how to search for this in just a moment. But if I keep digging into physics body 3D, I've opened that branch up. There are types of physical objects here, including one called a static body 3D. This is actually a branch on its own, and I could expand it out and find animatable body 3D, but I'm just going to stick with the one called static body. Static in this case means not moving, which is what we want our floor to not do. We don't want our floor to move. So I'm going to select that type of node. If you just want to search for static and find that exact node, it's a red one. It's called static body 3D, and I'll double click on it to add it into my game level. There it is. It should be a direct child. That means there's a direct line indented just once here below my game level because I had my level 1 root node selected when I pressed the plus and added this node in the first place. So now what I'll do here is name this node. If I double click on its name, I can select the text here, and I'm going to name this floor and press enter. So now that static body 2D is my floor. However, you'll notice that in the scene, in your actual 3D viewport, you don't see anything. You have it selected, and you have these control gizmos on your screen that you can move the floor around with. Don't do that though. You could, but we can't see anything right now because it turns out there's an error in my scene. If I go ahead and click on this little warning here, it tells me what's wrong. It says this node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. Consider adding a collision shape 3D or collision polygon 3D as a child of it to define its shape. That's what's wrong. We have a physics object, but it doesn't know what it should look like, and it doesn't know what its boundaries are. In other words, what its collision surface is, where its force field is, where other objects will collide with it. So I'm going to select that floor, and we're going to add 2 children nodes to it. When you construct an object in Godot, it's very common that you combine multiple nodes together in a little mini hierarchy so that you have an object with children, and the children give that object more information. In this case, I'm going to select the floor node that I just added, and I'm going to press the plus button. I'm going to add a node, and I'll see if I can find it manually here. I'll clear out my search. It should be under node 3D. It should be under visual instance. What we're looking for here is under geometry instance, perhaps. Yes, it is called mesh instance 3D. We want to add a 3D mesh object, like with polygons, into the scene, which is going to be a cube for our floor. We're going to stretch that floor out, but it's going to be a basic cube. If you don't want to find it in this node tree structure, you can simply search for mesh, and then I'll find it here. Mesh instance 3D is what you want. I'll double click on it. And if you did it right, you'll see that it's now a child of the floor because I just had my floor selected when we added it. Okay, this mesh instance doesn't look like anything either until we select it and go over to the inspector on the right side of the Godot editor. The inspector will show you properties of the current node that you have selected. So if I have a mesh instance selected, well, I can choose. You can see the first property here of that mesh is empty. Well, the mesh doesn't know what its polygons should be, essentially. So I'm going to click right next to empty here, and I can choose one of the default primitive types of meshes that Godot itself knows how to build for you. I'm going to select, after clicking this little arrow right here, a new box mesh. When I do that, it makes a new resource, in other words, a primitive type of data that Godot knows how to make right inside of Godot. In this case, now we have a little cube, a box in our game level. If I want to make this box look more like a floor, larger, but maybe not as tall, what I can do is click on this resource to expand it out. You can click on the little picture of the cube to expand its properties, the resource properties, and contract it, but I'll expand it, and I can now type in values for the size that I want this cube to be. I want the floor to be quite big, so I'm going to type in maybe 10 meters, and then I'll press tab by 0.5. Remember that the y-axis is up and down in Godot, so if I type in 0.5 for y, and then press tab to go to the next data input slot here, it'll make it shorter, half as tall as it was before, and I'll type 10 into the z-axis and press tab. So I have a 10 by 0.5 by 10 size cube. There we go. Is that enough to make a proper floor? Well, it turns out no. This floor, it still has that warning here. It's telling us that it needs a collision shape in order for the physical object, the static body 3D, to know where its force field is, where other objects will collide with it, like its force field. So I'm going to select that floor again, not the mesh instance, but the floor, because I need to add a second child to it. I'm going to select the floor and press plus. I'm going to search for, I'll clear out my search, for what's called a collision shape 3D. Where do I find this? Well, if I dig into the branch called Node 3D, it is right here. It's called collision shape 3D. Of course, you can search for that. I'll type in COLL, and I'll narrow my search down to that. And collision shape 3D is right here. I'll go ahead and double click on that to add it. A collision shape 3D is a lot like a mesh instance. We need to give a collision shape a resource. It's giving us a little warning to tell us this, by the way. If I click on the little warning, it tells me a shape must be provided for a collision shape 3D to function. Please create a shape resource for it. What it's telling me is, just like with the mesh node that we just added a moment ago, it needed to know what actual polygons, what type of a mesh to have. Our collision shape needs to know what shape of a force field and the size of the force field this object should have. So if I select that collision shape 3D and go over to the inspector on the right side of the Godot editor, it has a shape property, its first property over here. It's empty. So I'm going to click on the little downward arrow and pick a box shape 3D as its shape. If I selected a new box shape 3D and click to confirm, you can see that it made that same size of, I think it's 2 by 2 by 2 for the collision shape size. How do I change the size of this one? Well, like with the mesh, I can click on the box shape to expand its properties, or I can click to collapse that section as well. I can type values directly in, but I can also, in this case, because it's a collision shape, grab these little pink handles and stretch out. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. Stretch out that collision shape so it's approximately the right size, 10 meters across. And then I can go up here to its size and just type in manually 10 and press enter to confirm that. I'll do the same thing with the Z-axis as well. I'll drag that little pink handle and then just change it to 10 and press enter. And it's still too tall, so I'll make it a little bit shorter, but then type in 0.5 and press enter to make it exactly the same size as the mesh. I can go ahead and hide the mesh to just see the collision shape, and hopefully if I show and hide it, I can see that they're exactly the same size and in the exact same position. By the way, if you accidentally move your collision shape up or your mesh in some weird position, you can always select that node, go to the transform section of the properties in the inspector, and reset the position to 0 and 0 and 0 to reset it back to the very middle of your scene. Okay, so now we've constructed a floor for a 3D game level. How do I actually move my entire floor all at the same time? Because right now, if I select the floor over here in the scene dock and I use my little move tool, by the way, if I have my arrow tool selected, it'll give me all of the options for moving and rotating my selected object. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that move. If you have the move tool selected, you only have move or rotate or scale, depending on which tool you select. That will be the only one that's available for you, but the arrow tool is a good one to stick with most of the time. If I select the floor, the root node of the floor object, in other words, the static body 2D, and I move it, well, you could move the floor this way, but I'm going to warn you to actually do one little step before you try moving your floor around. I'll press Ctrl Z on my keyboard to put it back at 0, 0, 0 in my world. What you'll want to do here to make sure that you don't accidentally select just the mesh and move just the mesh around and then have to move the collision shape separately. But even when you do that, well, if you select the floor, you'll notice the floor still thinks it's at 0, 0, 0 in your world. To avoid all this headache, what you can do is I'll press Ctrl Z a few times to put everything back to the middle of my world at 0, 0, 0. What you'll want to do is group your floor together. And what that means is if you select your floor and press, it's right here, this little icon on your screen on the top bar. It looks like a little piece of abstract art. If you press this button, this is called the Group Selected Nodes button, and it makes sure that selected nodes children are not selectable. So if I select the floor and I press that button, you'll see that same little icon show up right next to the floor. It means that it's grouped with its children. And that means if you simply click in your 3D editor on that object, it will not select the children of the floor. It'll select the floor itself and then let you move the floor however you want. Okay, so if I move my floor down just a little bit, in fact, what I'll do is I'm going to press the Z button up here in this gizmo that's on screen that shows me which directions I can see my scene from. If I click on the little Z button, it'll take me straight to my rear orthogonal view. But if I click on that button again, it'll take me to my front view. What I'm going to do is move my floor up so that the top of the floor matches where the red line is, where that grid is in my scene. I want the floor to just meet up with that. So that's going to be the floor in my game level. Okay, let's go ahead and do a save. I'll press Ctrl S on my keyboard. How does my game level look when I'm playing it? Well, if I select my level 1 tab up here and I press the play scene button up here, it'll play the currently active scene with the active tab. It'll play that scene when you press the play scene button. And here it is. It looks very dull, but at least we can see our game floor through our camera. And if you need to move the camera, there's the camera. Back or up or rotate it, you can do that to see your whole floor. Why does it look so, well, gray? Well, our scene actually doesn't have any environment in it right now. We can see an environment, this nice, well, sort of nice sky and horizon and lighting in our editor. However, it's just showing a preview of what a sky and a light setup might look like. If I turn off these two buttons, it turns off the environment and then it turns off the simulated default lighting, you can see what the game level actually looks like. To add our own light, just a simple light for now, into the game level, I'll select my level 1 node here, the root node of my scene, and I'll press plus. What I'm going to do here is find a light for my scene. Where is that? Well, it's under node 3D. It's under visual instance, and I believe it is called, where is it? Light 3D. And I'm going to add a type of light called a directional light 3D. If you just search for direct like that, you'll find it, and I can double click on it. It'll add a light as a child, a direct child of level 1. What this light will do is if I move it up and rotate it to point sort of downward, but maybe diagonally downward, is it'll light our entire world with a nice kind of even sunlight that reaches every corner of my game world all at once. It's kind of nice. So if I drag this light object up, if I select it and then move it straight up, you can see it looks like a sun. And if I rotate it to point downwards, maybe not perfectly downwards, maybe I'll rotate it a little bit on a couple directions to make it a nice diagonal light like that. In fact, I'm going to make it so that it kind of points away from the camera in my game level, so that when my camera looks at my scene, the light will be shining on the front of the objects from where the camera can see the objects, so the objects don't look like they're in shadows. So what I'll do here is I'll drag the light up and over a little bit, just so it has a little bit of a top perspective as we're looking at it. Great. Let's go ahead and do a Control S to save, and I'll go ahead and press play scene to see how our scene looks now. And now you can see we have some even lighting in our environment. To make some objects in this game level besides our ground, we're actually going to do something a little bit different here. You've seen in the first part of this video how we construct a 3D physical object in a game level. We've made our floor. When you make a physical object in Godot, usually it's made out of 3 different nodes that you make into a little structure exactly as we have here. The first node is often the physical type of object that object exists as in your scene. In this case, we made our floor a static body 3D. Your static body, though, doesn't know what it looks like. So another node that makes up your object should be how that type of object looks. In this case, a mesh instance of a stretched out cube. Lastly, the physics object, in this case the static body 3D, needs to know its collision bounds, and for that we added a collision shape 3D, so we have a nice little set of 3 nodes, 1 parent, 2 children to make an object. However, if we make all objects like this in our level 1, like if I were to make a falling block and I made a physical object with a mesh and a collision shape, we could do that and build it in such a way that it actually falls with gravity right in this scene. However, if I want to take that same block object and add it into different levels, well, that would be trickier. So what you actually do in Godot is you make every object that you want to reuse across different levels as their own separate scene to begin with. So to make a falling block object, we're going to go up this row of tabs where we created our first scene in the last lesson, and I'm going to press this new plus to add a new empty scene that's just going to be a block object that's reusable. If I go back to level 1, of course I can still be in this scene and work on it, but now I can switch scenes just like tabs in a web browser. To make a falling block, we're not going to start off this scene with one of these default options. We're going to create our falling block right away by pressing this plus and adding the type of physical object we want the object to start with. In this case, if I clear out my last search, the type of node that a falling block is going to be one of those physics type of objects. If I go under node 3D and then under, if I can move my mouse to get this prompt out of the way, if I go under collision object 3D, and then physics body 3D, it turns out that unlike a static body 3D, which do not fall with gravity on their own, that there is a type of node called a rigid body 3D. And if I read the description of this very quickly, down here if I select it, I can read a physics body which is moved by 3D physics simulation, useful for objects that have gravity and can be pushed by other objects. And that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to select rigid body 3D. You can search for rigid and find it pretty easily like that. I'll go ahead and double click. And that node, not a node 3D like we started off our level with, should be the root node. So rigid body is the root node of this new scene, not a node 3D. To make our rigid body actually look like something, I'm going to select the root node here, and just like with our floor, I'm going to press plus, and I'm going to add a mesh instance 3D, which I have down here in my recent lists here, so I can just double click right there to add a mesh. I don't have to search for it or find it in that node tree anymore. It's in my recents list, which is nice. So I can select that mesh instance 3D. I can go over to the inspector. I can make it have a mesh. I'll add a default. Ooh, let's add a cube mesh, which is right here called box mesh. And once I add that, you'll see what it looks like. If I turn on that fake or temporary lighting and environment, you'll see how it would look in a more proper level. But again, we don't have any lighting or any cameras in this scene at all, and we won't. Okay, so now I need to go back to my rigid body 3D and add one more thing. It has that same warning from before. It needs a collision shape 3D in order to work properly. So I'm going to select the root node. I'll press plus. I'm going to go to my recents list here and select a collision shape 3D and double click on it just like that. It has a warning, of course, the exact same as just a few minutes ago. We need to give it a shape. And so I'll select it. I'll go over to the shape property in the inspector, and I'll give it a new box shape 3D collision shape, just like that. And because I didn't change the shape of my mesh, my default cube mesh, and I'm not changing the shape of my collision shape, it will just work. They're the same exact size by default. Isn't that handy? That's it. I think we're good. If I save this scene, it's not saved right now. I'll press Control S on my keyboard. I can save this as rigid body 3D. No. I'm going to press cancel. It's a good habit to get into to name your objects, the root node of the objects to start. I'm going to call this block with a capital B, and I'll press enter. There we go. If I now save this scene, Control S, Godot is smart enough to recommend the name that you give the root node in the scene to the actual scene file, which ends with .tscn. So block.tscn, great. It's in my res project folder, which is actually my project folder, and I'll just press save without changing anything. So now I have a block scene, and it's a rigid body object, which should fall with gravity, but it's not in my level. How do I get this scene into this scene? Well, what you do is you simply select the root node of your scene to add an object to it. But instead of going up to plus to add new, fresh default nodes, what you do is you select the root node and then you press the link button. This link button is called Instantiate Child Scene. If I press the link button, it'll let me choose what other scene I want to make an instance of in my current level 1 scene. In this case, I will select block.tscn. Please never ever take your current scene and add an instance of itself into itself. You don't want to do that. So I'll select block, not itself. And with block selected, I'll press open. And now I have that falling block in my game level. Of course, I can move it up. You'll notice that I didn't have to press in my block scene that group button like I did for the floor, because this block is its own scene and I saved it as its own scene. And now I'm making an instance of the block in my level 1 scene. I don't have to press that group together button because scenes automatically group themselves together when you make instances of them in another scene. Okay. You might also notice a special little icon next to the block over here in the scene dock. This little icon shows you that this is an instance of a different scene. And if I didn't have the block scene open, if I close this tab up here, what I could always do if I want to edit the block ever is I can press this little button and it'll jump over back into the original scene where I can make changes, save those changes, Control S, and then go back to level 1, and it will affect all of the instances of this block in all of my game levels simply by editing the original one again. So changes you make in one scene will propagate out to all of the instances of that scene in all of your game levels. So now I can take the block, I can move it up, and maybe I'll rotate it a little bit just to see what happens. If I go ahead and press Control S to save, and then I'll go ahead and press play scene. We can see it falls and kind of tumbles a little bit. Now you'll notice that our light does not have, or it's not casting any shadows, which makes things hard to see. So I'm going to fix that. I'm going to select that directional light 3D, and over in the inspector, if I go to the shadow section of the properties, I can enable shadows to be on. And now we see a shadow being cast by the cube on the floor, and that will look especially good when I save, Control S, and press play scene again, because now I'll see a shadow underneath the block and it'll land, and that'll look great. Can I make more blocks or more instances of that same block in my level? Of course I can. If I select this block, I can simply right click on it and say duplicate. But before I do that, what I might do is change this block instance's name to block 1. And then if I duplicate it, Godot is smart enough to name the next one block 2. Isn't that nice? If I move this block up, maybe I'll move it over a little bit, maybe I'll rotate it. I now have 2 blocks that might interact in interesting ways. Maybe I'll move that one over like that and move it a little bit up. Let's go ahead and press play scene to see what this looks like. Hey, look at that. Some tumbling blocks. What I'll do is take both blocks. If I hold shift, I can grab multiple blocks there. I'll duplicate them both at the same time. I'll then move them both up, block 3 and 4. I'll rotate them, and let's go ahead and save, Control S, and I'll press play scene. And now we have some nice falling blocks. There we go. Okay, so in this lesson, we have learned how to construct 3D physical objects in our 3D environment for our game level. We have learned how to construct a floor, starting with a static body 3D object, as well as using a simple 3D mesh object and a collision shape. In doing so, we learned about the inspector and different properties of each type of object in the inspector, including how to make a resource like a primitive mesh or a primitive collision shape for our collision shape 3D. And in this lesson, we learned how to make reusable objects in their own scenes by making the entire object as we normally would in a different scene. You can then reuse that object and make instances of it in different game levels. And if you update or change the original scene and save it and go back to anywhere there's an instance of that type of object, it will make changes to that object there. I'll quickly do a demo of this. If I go back to my block scene, take the mesh instance, go to its mesh and expand out its mesh resources properties. If I change the mesh to be only 0.5 meters tall, and then I change the collision shape to also be, I'll expand out the box shape resources properties here, and I'll type in the same 0.5 meters on the y-axis. Now that block is half as tall. If I save this scene, Control S, and then I go back to my level 1 scene, you can see that now all of the blocks have been updated to be that same exact size and shape. And if I press play scene, well, all of those new blocks fall in a different way. Okay, that will be it for this one though. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.